Hi, welcome everyone. This is Moffat Library. Thank you all for joining us. We have Johanna Yaun today. She's the Orange County historian who is responsible for helping to record, promote, organize, and just protect some of the fascinating history that we have here in Orange County. And today we will be talking about two people who were almost president. Thank you so much for joining us, Johanna.
Thank you for having me. You mentioned about the role of the county historian, and it is something to mention to everyone because in New York State we have a municipal historian's law which requires every town, village, city, and county to have a historian on staff. It's something that only exists in New York. There's no other state in the country that has that law, so it's very unique to us, and it's a great resource. So when anybody out there wants to know about their family history or their the local town history or the home that they live in, there's always a first place to call, which would be your whatever level, town, village, or city first, and then eventually the county, and then there's a state historian above that. So it's a great resource that we have. And as Orange County historian, a lot of my talks and a lot of my research has to do with making connections that maybe wouldn't be made in any other place. So in this particular talk, I've taken two individuals who were born in Orange County that were in different time periods, different sets of circumstances, but both of them somehow made it very close to the presidency, and scholars believe that both of them may have had a chance at the presidency if circumstances had been different. So we're taking these two people and looking at them through that lens. Now I didn't test, here we go, next page. Okay. Looking broader, Orange County has a lot of ties to the presidency throughout history. So when the end of the Revolutionary War was occurring, George Washington was headquartered in Newburgh, and his troops were at the New Windsor Cantonment. And it was from that location that many important things happened, but one of those important things was that he received a letter from a general who was stationed at Fishkill across the river, Colonel Louis Nicola, who urged Washington to have his eyes set on some kind of a monarchy in the future to run our country. And it's in that correspondence between Washington and Nicola that Washington comes out very strongly in stating that he will never be king, that he believes in a republic form of government. So we have a tie to that, to Washington really thinking about the end of the war and how we're going to transition to peacetime while he's here in Orange County. And then there's plenty of other people through history who have a connection. The Roosevelts are a big one because they were married into the Delano family, and the Delanos had their estate at Newburgh and Bombville. There's other less direct ties, like my head's in the way here, but Joseph Hova, who was appointed ambassador to Mexico during Nixon's administration. And we've got plenty of other individuals who had close connections, like William Belknap, who worked in President Grant's cabinet. And you can see some of the others here as well. One of my favorite ones, actually, which is across the river, not so much here, but when Roosevelt ran against Thomas Dewey, he was running against somebody from his own county, and that's the only time in U.S. history that happened, that two people from the same county ran against each other. They were both from Dutchess County. So there's a lot to talk about in regard to the presidential associations here. Of course, there's Donald Trump also. He graduated from NEMA in Cornwall, and I live in Newburgh, and I see his plane fly overhead a lot. It's kept at the Seward Airport base. Okay, so today, though, we're going to talk about two really different, I think most people would say different people if you were to throw these two names at anybody from the outside, not knowing their connection to this location. So on the right here, we have William Seward, and on the left, we have Geraldine Ferraro. And as we go through it, we'll look at where they're from. But here's a map of Orange County, and Seward was from an area sort of on the southern section, that southern triangle area of the county, and Geraldine Ferraro was from the riverside over there on the east side. William Seward was born in Florida, New York. It's just a few miles to the south of Goshen, which was the county seat at the time and still is. And his home surprisingly still exists when you're driving through town, it's behind the Mapes family house. So it used to be up close to the road at 23 North Main Street, and then it was disassembled, taken apart by the Mapes family. They built a grander estate, and then they rebuilt Seward's childhood home in the back as a to use as sort of a farm building. But it's still there, and there's a picture of it, as you can see, and that's a picture that I took of it a couple of years ago. But there's a big effort right now, a group of people who are trying to restore this building and open it to the public in some capacity, maybe associated with the school that's nearby called Seward School, and have it as a public resource for people to be able to study Seward in his childhood roots in Orange County, which you'll see aren't arbitrary. They really shaped a lot of his beliefs later in life. So William Seward was born in Orange County in 1801. And the significance of that time is that it was a period of very fast-paced growth economically. So the Revolutionary War brought a lot of people through the area. That's a very long story, but essentially you've got the British in New York City, you have the Patriots that are in our area, and then you have this no man's land in between that they fight over. The British attack and come up the river in 1777. There's times when Washington plans attacks in New York City. Of course, he doesn't end up attacking New York City. He attacks at Yorktown, which ends up ending the war. But this back and forth that happens here causes a lot of displacement in the area. So you have loyalists fleeing to New York City and then eventually fleeing to Canada, and you have waves of people coming in from these British-controlled territories trying to set up a new life on the north side of the Patriot lines. And then when the war comes to an end, you have a lot of New Englanders who start to press west. Some of it is spurred by the fact that during the Revolutionary War, there was very little money to go around to pay the troops. So Washington and some of the other leaders come up with a plan to give land grants to individuals who fought. So you have this Western movement that starts or I guess it accelerates after that time. People start pushing west, coming through the Hudson Valley, and the areas that are in the inland parts that are primarily farms do very well. An influx of people, but also of commerce. And Orange County had good land for farming. The Black Dirt area down by where Seward was from was known for produce, and the areas around Goshen and Chester and Monroe and those parts were known for dairy production. There's also technological changes that are happening at this time. So the sloops essentially are being used originally to move the goods around. Then they start to have better roads to transport by wagon, and then they eventually have better, then they eventually have trains where they can transport milk and cheese and things faster and fresher down into the city. So this whole area is thriving, especially related to its farming commerce. Seward, being from Florida, just a few miles from Goshen, he shows the most promise of the children in his household for an education. So some of the children come to take over the farm and stay local. He is sent to get a little bit higher end education at the Farmers Hall Academy, which is still in Goshen. It's the town hall today. And it had been considered a premier school in the area. There were really two. There was this one, the Farmers Academy, and there was the one called the Montgomery Academy, which was in Montgomery, New York. And when you're reading about some of the highly educated people that come out of Orange County at the time, they usually are associated with one of those two schools. And those two schools did train a lot of statesmen and a lot of lawyers down the road. So he originally went to the school as a child, and he was learning essentially the 3 R's, the reading, writing, arithmetic. And it was based on a curriculum that had been built up by Noah Webster, who had been a schoolmaster at the school in the years preceding the time that Seward was there. But the school continued for a very long time to teach in the same tradition. And he, excelled at school. There's stories of him as a child where he was subjected to bullying, essentially, because he was the sort of nerdy smart kid in school, and walking back and forth home caused a lot of friction with the other children. So there's a couple of stories where he talks about having always had his nose in a book. And as soon as he's done with his preliminary schooling, he goes on to college. He ends up going upstate to college, to Union College. But this issue of slavery needs to be talked about, because when he was growing up at his home in Florida, he was in the midst of it. There were his own family owned slaves, and there were slave owning families in the community. And it was at the same exact time politically that the gradual emancipation law was passed. So he was born into a time where there was a quasi freedom, where some people were being freed, others were waiting for their freedom. But there was a sense that that was the direction that the country was going, and especially that New York State was going. But it also was causing rising tensions with the southern states as well, because of many people in the South in bondage trying to flee north, knowing that they would be able to receive their freedom here. And this document that's in this picture is a document that's in the Orange County Historian's collection. It was donated to our collection about 2 years ago. And it is the only that I know of slave document that it's a slave receipt that exists from Orange County that survived. So the family that donated it, the White family, were very adamant about this history being preserved, because the reason we don't have a lot of these documents is because there are so many people that are nervous about bringing these things to light or sharing the fact that their families were slave owners. So we're very grateful that this family was forward thinking enough to save this document and pass it on to us. So we do have this evidence of slavery in Orange County here. And Seward himself grew up in a home where his family owned 2 women and a child, and they lived in the same household as him. You saw that picture of his home, which was extremely modest. So you've got a large family with, I think it was 6 children or so, growing up in the same environment as these people who were held in bondage. And it was his relationship with those people that he credits with shaping his beliefs on slavery being wrong. And he also credits his parents with teaching him that although these people are owned by the household, that they have human rights and human dignity that goes beyond that bondage. And so he searches his soul for all of his early life, and then as he enters into public service, he is shaped by that and comes out very strongly as an anti-slavery statesman. So when he went off to college, he first goes up to Union College, and he struggles a little bit with what it is that he wants to do in life. He thinks about becoming a schoolmaster. At one point, he even drops out of school, and he, with a friend, takes a ship down to Savannah, Georgia, and works his way inland and finds a school in the South where he has some sort of a connection, family connection or a friend's connection who's recommended him to go there. He shows up and gets a job as a schoolmaster in a new school in Georgia. And he runs into trouble right away, so he starts to work there. And there's rumors about what it is that the trouble was. And there's a letter that he receives much later in life claiming that he had a child there, born there. So it's possible that the reason that he ran into trouble was because he had an affair with one of the enslaved women that was living in that town. So he, although it's not clear, he writes back to his parents after a couple of months, and he ends up coming back to Goshen in Florida, to kind of make amends with his family because he had taken off without graduating properly. He ends up working in a local law office while he's there in Goshen, and he eventually makes his way back to college to finish out the last year of schooling. And when he's finished with that schooling, he decides to go full on into law. He works in New York City a little bit, he works in Goshen a little bit, he's very discontented with it. But he meets one of his sister's friends from her school, her boarding school, and her name was Frances Miller, and he decides to court her, and she's from Auburn, New York. So he ends up going out to Auburn, New York. It's the county seat in that area. There's a lot of opportunity for a young lawyer, and Frances Miller's father was a judge. He ends up marrying her and moving into the house that's pictured here with the Miller family. Seward does that for a few years, but quickly has an interest and always has an interest in public service and in politics. And he gets stirred into action because of a anti-Masonic movement that takes place. So there's this Mason group, and there's a member of that group that claims that he's going to come forward with the secrets of the Masonic Society, ends up murdered because of it. And then there's a public backlash against the murder. And this anti-Masonic group kind of emerges from that. Seward joins up with that group. He's young and energetic, intelligent. He's writing about the issues. And he ends up going to Philadelphia for a convention where he really shines as an outspoken member of that budding political group. And he kind of catches the ear of some of the people who are influential in New York State. When he comes back to New York, he's recommended to run for office, and he ends up as a legislator in Albany not too long after that. So he departs Auburn, and for the rest of his life, he has a very active travel schedule and doesn't spend a lot of time back in Auburn. So he leaves his wife behind at the home of her father. So there's a lot of family around, they have children, and he goes off to Albany, where he ends up spending a good part of the next decade. While he's in Albany, he becomes essentially a rising star. He becomes very good friends with this Thurlow Wood, who is a newspaper editor who's helping to shape Seward's reputation and promote him. In this time, it's very different than today, where somebody stands up and they promote themselves for a candidacy. In this era, you had to have advocates that would do that for you. It kind of comes out of that Washington tradition where George Washington is saying, I don't want to be president, but everybody pushed him to do it. And so he does it out of some sort of a noble obligation. And that system persisted for a long time. So this era, Seward's not standing up and saying, I want to be governor, but it's people like his friend here promoting him and trying to get him into that role. And Thurlow Weed nominates him for governor in 1834, but he's not successful. But 4 years later, 1838, and then 2 years after that, in 1840, he's elected twice, serving as governor of New York State. And it's almost funny to think of him as governor, because I don't think he's remembered that way at all. But a lot of the work that he did as governor of New York State is what set the platform for him to move on into national politics. And some of that was being anti-slavery and trying to pass laws that would enable newly freed Black Americans to have rights. And also, he's a lawyer, so he understands that this has to start on a legal level. The rights have to be guaranteed that way. He's also pro-immigrant and pro-Catholic in a time when there's a lot of backlash against Catholics. The dominant influx of immigrants at the time would have been Irish and Catholic immigrants coming in, and there was a backlash against that. So he ends up being outspoken on these issues that make him a target in the conservative South. And then with the politics of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1834 and his beliefs on that matter, he ends up sort of famous in a way on the Whig side, but hated by a lot of the conservative Southerners. In 1860, the Republican Party is beginning to emerge, and Seward, just like he had with the anti-Masonic party, he got excited about this new party that was emerging, and he joined up. So he's one of the early founders of the Republican Party. So Seward in 1860 was largely seen as the front runner for the Republican nomination, and he was, because of being so outspoken on these issues, his friends who are his close advisors actually tell him that, to get out of here during the campaign season so that the media at the time isn't dwelling on some of these more controversial issues, but that he can show himself as a leader in diplomacy. So he heads off to Europe to do a short tour of Europe to show himself as a leader in foreign affairs. And while he's gone, he's nominated for the presidency, and it looks like a shoo-in. It looks like he's going to be the Republican nominee. But as the ballots get cast, it becomes clear that it's a gridlock between Seward and Lincoln. And even though Seward gets the initial bulk of the votes, as the ballots happen, eventually Lincoln ends up with the nomination. And it was a surprise upset, but it really came down to the fact that Lincoln had been out of office for about a decade before this happened. So he hadn't been as outspoken during the 1850s, which was a really volatile time as far as the slavery issue was concerned. And it was almost like choosing somebody with a little bit of a thinner record in order to try to gain as many other supporters from the outside, or the more moderate supporters. And so Lincoln gets chosen. Now, Seward could have just very bitterly walked away from it at this point because he really believed that he was going to be the nominee, but he doesn't. What he does instead is he realizes that if Lincoln cannot win New York, because New Yorkers really don't know of Lincoln or his reputation at the time, but he feels like he has to help promote him, because if he doesn't win New York, he won't end up winning the entire country. So Seward campaigns very heavy for Lincoln. They actually had met each other many years earlier. They had met each other at a convention in Boston, and they had a nice discussion about their beliefs on slavery. So Seward knew that he could at least trust Lincoln's instinct on the issue, and he knew that if they didn't win New York, that the Republican nominee wouldn't win the election. So he campaigned for Lincoln. And when Lincoln does get elected, Seward ends up working for him as the Secretary of State. And at the time, he had a great influence on Lincoln. There's a movie called Lincoln, which talks a lot about their relationship, so probably some of you have seen that. And they end up navigating a lot of this, the beginnings of the war together. Lincoln relies very heavily on Seward for his advice and for his hard work, his work ethic as well. And one of the things that he's assigned to do right away is to deal with the foreign policy issues, because it is seen, or it's viewed, that if the British or the French or any other foreign powers start to get involved with the Civil War on one side or the other, but particularly on the Confederate side, that it would be a disaster for the Union side trying to keep it together. And this is another thing that's Seward's not always necessarily associated with, but when at the end of the Civil War, Lincoln is assassinated, on the same night, a second culprit is sent to attack Seward as well. So the people who plotted to kill Lincoln were plotting also to take out Seward in the same night. So Seward had been injured earlier in the year in a carriage accident. So he was laid up in bed, and his family was attending to him, and doctors were attending to him at the time. That a man named Lewis Powell broke into the house and stabbed Seward. And because he was bound up from his injuries that he had from a previous accident, they believe that it's possible that that's why the assailant wasn't able to stab him, or wasn't able to penetrate some of the bandages that were around him. So he survived the attack. And another interesting part of Seward's life is that his abolitionist beliefs and work brought him into a close friendship with Harriet Tubman. So in the 1850s, we have the Fugitive Slave Act is passed in 1850, and it creates an entire decade where the Underground Railroad becomes vital, because so many people are fleeing from the South, but they have to make it all the way up to Canada in order to be free. And so, of course, New York is a big state with a big border along Canada. And so it becomes vital for people who are trying to escape. Of course, Harriet Tubman is famous for all of the trips that she took back and forth to Maryland to free other people after she had done so for herself. But Seward's house in Auburn, New York becomes a stop on the Underground Railroad. And like I said earlier, Seward isn't home a lot. He's off in politics in Albany, New York City, he's in Washington, he's traveling around campaigning for candidates. He's traveling to Europe sometimes for various diplomatic affairs. He's not in Auburn a lot. So I think in some ways, Seward gets a lot of credit for being the one opening his home to fugitives, but it was really his wife, Frances, who was there day to day, accommodating people as they traveled through. And it is said that their kitchen was used as a location for people to rest and eat and be clothed before going on their way. And later in life, Harriet Tubman purchases property from Seward and ends up living out the rest of her life in Auburn on property adjacent to his home. And Seward had many accomplishments as Secretary of State. Of course, he survived the attack, so he ends up working in both Lincoln's administration and then Andrew Johnson's administration as well. So over the course of his time as the Secretary of State, he, as I said, was very involved with the issues of the 13th Amendment, of keeping foreign powers out of the Civil War. And then as Johnson comes into power, he's very important to making sure that Lincoln's vision isn't dropped, when the next presidency comes in. So he keeps the stability from one administration to the next through Reconstruction. And one of the last things he does as Secretary of State is that he's involved in the purchase of the state of Alaska from the Russians. So, as I said, what is he remembered for? It's funny how after I've just spoken for a few minutes about all of these great accomplishments of his life, it's really the last one I think that most people remember him for. So if you ask the average school child who is William Seward, a lot of the time they will say Seward's Folly, the purchase of Alaska. And I guess that's relevant in the sense that, the whole entire state of Alaska, the people that live there would know that story well. But from our perspective, from the local perspective of Seward growing up here, it's not necessarily the story that's on the forefront for us. But he's remembered for that because of some of the books and interest in Lincoln, and especially that movie Lincoln that came out a decade ago. There is that association of Seward with Lincoln, and his role in ending slavery. And then, we're kind of going backwards. What I guess the point I'm trying to make here today is what he's really not remembered for anymore, but should be, is that he came very close to being the Republican nominee in 1860, and could have been the one that was in the White House at the time that the Civil War broke out. So that brings us to our second person that we're going to talk about. So the second person is Geraldine Ferraro. And Geraldine Ferraro was born in Newburgh, downtown in the city. Her home is still on Du Bois Street, not too far from St. Luke's Hospital, if you know that neighborhood. And she actually was, when she was first born, she was brought home to a house on Mill Street on top of a small apartment that was on top of a 5 and dime shop that her family owned. But in the first couple of years of her life, as they were able to purchase a home, this is the home that they purchased and moved into. And then she lived here until her father's death when she was in high school, essentially. So Newburgh in 1935, totally different time period than what we were just talking about with Seward. What happens in between, of course, is that we have the Civil War, we have this industrialization that takes place in Newburgh and in the rest of Orange County. We still have the farms on the western part, but we get more of these downtowns and even the villages end up with main streets for more commerce and industrialization. So by this point, also we've passed by essentially the height in the late 19th century of industry, and then the World War I industrial bump that happens. So there's a lot of textile factories in this area in Newburgh that end up producing for the war effort. And the DuPont factory employs thousands of people producing waterproof clothing and tents and capes and things for the World War I trench troops. And there's also shipbuilding that's happening here. So like I said, in Seward's time, there were the sloops being built. By this time, there's dry docks and other things related to the war production and steel ships. This time also in Newburgh was a bustling time. So it's the Depression essentially. And when you think of the Depression, like from what we read or hear in movies, you think of it as a time when there weren't a lot of opportunities. But in this area in Newburgh, there was a theater district, there was an entertainment district, there was a lot of live music, there was a lot of vibrancy here in this port city. So when Geraldine Ferraro was growing up, the Depression was happening on a national level, but on a very local level in her little world, she would have been in a small Italian American community that had a lot of busy entertainment happening all around. So her parents had a five and dime shop. They were Italian immigrants. They had a five and dime shop on Mill Street. They did whatever they had to get by. Her father drove a truck, and her mother was a seamstress. In that era, you could work in a factory itself, or you could take basically consignment work, where you would take items home to sew at home in the home while you're watching your children, and then return them for pay. And that's what her mother did at different times. Her father had a lot of different things that he got into. At one point, he even ran a speakeasy called the Roxy, which was like a little nightclub. And they were part of this Italian American community. So there's some controversy surrounding her father's life, Dominic Ferraro, because when he died in 1944, it was said that he had had a heart attack, but there are reports that he was expected to testify against a network of gangsters that were part of the Lucky Luciano's group. And what was going on was that during this Prohibition era and afterwards, there were a couple of distilleries that had been built into some of the old abandoned factories. And Lucky Luciano came in, put an agent in Newburgh. His name was Dominic Petrelli, and he built this house that's in the picture. And Dominic Petrelli was sort of like the local, the local mobster that watched over that operation. And some of the truck driving that Dominic Ferraro was doing was moving around the liquor from this network of bootleggers. So that's something that's, I don't even think maybe even Geraldine Ferraro knew herself, because her father died when she was very young. She went off to school, and she was questioned about it later when she was running for the vice presidency, and didn't seem to know a lot about it. So it's a little bit of a foggy situation, and I've seen a little bit of evidence towards it, but I have to get myself as a county official, have some access to some of the records. I need to get into the indictment records at some point and see if I can find anything on what was going on with this network, and if Dominic Ferraro was involved in it. But it's a question mark, and it's something that comes up a lot locally. So she was told after her father died, she was able to go to Mount St. Mary College, which is now the college, but at the time it was a high school. She was able to go there and have her tuition paid. And she was told at the time it was from money from properties in Italy that were being rented. Some people say that it was not, that it was from somebody in this network. After Petrelli was, this gangster Petrelli was, what do you call it? He was expelled from the country. He was sent back to Italy. There was a second guy that came in who was, now I'm not remembering the name, Kiki Hayden's father, who came in and ran it. And he had a reputation for always helping people. So like there's a story that somebody told me that when the family didn't have any shoes, they were sent down to speak with this man who provided for them. And so there's some story that maybe when they didn't have the tuition money, that she was provided for. So Ferraro ends up at Mount St. Mary. She does extremely well as a student. She's voted most likely to succeed, and she wants to go off to college. At the time, of course, women are usually being pushed into either education or to nursing. She chooses education initially, and she gets a teaching degree. She becomes a teacher at an elementary school, PS 70 or PS 57, and she ends up kind of unhappy doing that kind of work. It just isn't enough. It isn't challenging enough for her, and she decides that she wants to become a lawyer. So she goes to night school, and she receives a law degree in 1961, at a time when not a lot of women were graduating from the program. Later in life, she would talk about some of the challenges associated with that. Some of the people along the way that tried to discourage her from that line of work, but she stuck with it, and she received her law degree and then ended up working for her husband, who was in real estate. So she provided the legal work for that business for the next decade or so. All the while, though, she was becoming very interested in politics and starting to do local advocacy work, volunteering in the Democratic associations that were around, and becoming very good friends with Mario Cuomo. So he becomes an ally and a promoter of her work, and helps to propel her into a position as the Queen's District Attorney. While she's serving there, she is faced with a lot of challenges, seeing how the system is really stacked against women and children, and she starts to work on reforms that'll help make the process easier for women in abusive relationships, or for children who have little opportunity, or for especially people with financial challenges that are keeping them from thriving. She ran as a law and order Democrat, and being as the district attorney helped to seal that reputation for her, and that was something that she ran on later as well. So as you see here, she's involved in cases that have to do with these various women's and children issues, and also issues with the elderly, and she becomes, as she said herself, very angry about some of the challenges that were in the legal system, and adamant about trying to change them. So she ends up running for Congress and served 3 terms there, continuing the law and order platform, continuing to advocate for legal reforms. And as she gets into politics in this way on a national level, she's always a person who shows up and does the hard work and volunteers for committees, and gets trusted over time with more and more responsibility. And by the time of the 1984 convention, she is asked to be the chairwoman of the platform committee. So there she's in the weeds, working on strategies and working on platform ideas for the entire party. And during this time, as the party leaders are trying to choose their candidates for president and vice president, they end up deciding that she would be the best person for that role. So she is chosen to serve or to run for vice president. Her presidential candidate was Walter Mondale, and as I was reminded earlier as we were getting ready, he just passed away this last week or so. So you may have seen him in the news. But she ran with him, and was a competent partner to him. And there are many people who, looking back on it now, historians or political people, who say that actually she was the stronger of the two in a lot of ways and carried the campaign, and that possibly as a candidate herself may have even done better than Walter Mondale had in getting votes. Of course, running against Reagan would have been difficult, no matter who was nominated. He's such a popular candidate. So they lose the election, and she famously made a comment that the door's been opened that can't be closed again. So she understood that even though she didn't win that position, that she had set a precedent and been the first to run as a woman for vice president. She's appointed later as a U.S. ambassador to the UN. She continues to advocate for women's and children's rights and rights of the elderly. She founds a nonprofit, America's Concern for Tomorrow, to try to advocate for more women in politics. And she stays in politics as a commentator on the news, throughout her lifetime, so until she passed away. She did live long enough to see, yeah, there it is. She did live long enough to see a second female candidate for vice president when Sarah Palin was nominated, but not long enough to see Kamala Harris's win as the first female vice president. So again, as I mentioned, Walter Mondale's been in the news recently, and of course, the other thing that's been in the news recently is the election of Kamala Harris. So her name has come up quite frequently recently. It's very relevant. So that brings us to the conclusion, which is here are two people. One's a Republican, one's a Democrat, one's a male, one's a female, one's a Catholic, one's a Protestant, one's a, you know, you can go on and on. They're very, very different people from different times, fighting for different things, but both of them share some of the things together. Their personality traits of being ambitious, being the one that'll get the hard work done, and that's how they both built a reputation long before they were chosen for the public roles that they ended up in. They both had this idea of fighting for the underdog. So in Seward's case, it was fighting for the formerly enslaved or the currently enslaved, trying to get an end to slavery. He was always fighting for the immigrants that were coming through the area and faced with discrimination. And then you have Ferraro fighting for women's rights and for children's rights, people who can't speak up for themselves. So you have these two very different people, but what they fundamentally believed was that you needed to stand up to fight for the freedom of others, that others could have the same freedom that they enjoyed. And that is the end. Does anyone have any questions?